Ze'ev Orenstein is the Director of International Affairs for the City of David Foundation in Jerusalem. The City of David is an ancient city, the capital of an ancient kingdom, one that over recent years Israeli archaeologists have been unearthing. It's near the western wall of the Temple Mount, atop which there is the Al-Aqsa compound, also known to Muslims as Al-Haram al-Sharif, the Noble Sanctuary. What does any of that have to do with foreign policy and national security? Well, quite a lot, as you'll soon learn from Ze'ev, who is sitting across the table from me in FDD's cozy studio. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're virtually with us here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome, Ze'ev. Glad to see you here.
Good to be here.
Look, just tell us a little bit about yourself, quickly, your journey, how you became immersed in archaeology and the Bible and history and all of that, just so people know where you're coming from, literally and figuratively.
So I grew up in the OK state of New Jersey until I went for a gap year post-high school to Israel. And during that gap year, I didn't really know much about Israel growing up, very, very little. And during my gap year, we spent a Sabbath in the old city of Jerusalem. And the teacher was speaking to the group of students in this program, about 80 of us. And he began talking about the 1967 Six-Day War and the events leading up to it. And he spoke about his experiences growing up in America at the time and how the Jewish community in America in 1967 is begging Israel to send the children to America. Why? We're about 20 years past the Holocaust at that point. And the sense was, this is going to be round two. Israel's about to be wiped out. So at least there'll be a surviving remnant. In Israel, they were converting parks into mass graves, future mass graves. And there was a joke in the country at the time that the last person to leave the country should shut the lights at the airport. This was it. Israel would have a nice 19-year run, but it was not going to reach 20.
Because this war, the 1967 war, later named the Six-Day War, this was once again, all Israel's neighbors attacking with the clear goal of the extermination of Israel and genocide of the Israeli people. I mean, it's important to recognize that's what Nasser in Egypt, they were very clear on this. If you look
100%.
at their quotes, the Arab League, all of them. Yeah.
The amazing thing about it, two points. One is that in 1967, before the Six-Day War, Egypt was controlling Gaza. Jordan was controlling Judea and Samaria, what others refer to as the West Bank. There were no quote-unquote occupied territories. So in 1967, when all of Israel's neighbors decided to destroy Israel, it wasn't because of the plight of the Palestinians or anyone else. It was simply because we want to destroy Israel. The only real difference between what happened in 1967 or 1948 and October 7th was they did not yet have the GoPro cameras to film what they were attempting to do. And thankfully, they were not successful in 1967. And this teacher of mine goes on to share how not only was Israel not destroyed, but in a mere 6 days, Israel nearly quadruples in size and returns to virtually every place that is historically or biblically significant to the Jewish people. We're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about places like Hebron.
They were in Jerusalem, but they took they took East Jerusalem.
Yeah, the part of Jerusalem that really historically matters. When people speak about Jerusalem, whether you're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, no one's talking about the Knesset and Israel's parliament. No one's talking about the King David Hotel. Everyone, for billions of people, the most significant mile on the planet is the mile that contains places like the Temple Mount, the old city of Jerusalem. You have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You have the Garden Tomb, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, the City of David. That's Jerusalem for billions of people.
And people have to understand this, and I'm amazed how many don't. So when Israel declared its independence after the British Union Jack came down, until then, the British Empire was in charge. Before that, the Ottoman Empire was in charge. In fact, you can go back centuries, you can tell me about that. And it's one foreign empire after another. The first time an indigenous people says, hey, we are going to decolonize. We are not going to have an empire. That's when the Jews declared independence and the state of Israel was born. I'm not wrong about that. That's the first time.
Well, if you want to be technical, you can say it's the second time. The first time was the first time we had our Commonwealth in the land of Israel, which was ended by the Babylonians. We then came back again, ended by the Romans, and then we came back after 2,000 years, despite having a continuous presence in the land during that long, dark exile. But, from the year 70 CE until 1948, during that 1950 years or so, every power that ruled over the land was a foreign empire.
Was a foreign empire.
And that includes even the Muslim period of rule, that even when the Muslims were ruling, at various points of history, their center of rule was either in Arabia, it could have been in Egypt, it could have been in Turkey, but it was never
Damascus at one point, yeah.
But it was never the land of Israel. It was never, There was no Palestine in the sense of we have an autonomous government and a flag and a nation, and it was always part of a larger empire.
Yeah, I don't think many of the kids in the Tentifada know that. They should, but I don't necessarily think it do. Now that, of course, Israel, it declares its independence. All of its neighbors, all the Arab states around it, wage a war to wipe it out as quickly as possible. That war does not end in a peace treaty. It ends in a ceasefire and an armistice. And part of that armistice is, guess what? The Jordanians, we can talk about who the Jordanians are, and Israelis don't like to talk about this because they're at peace with Jordan, I understand. But the Jordanians had had Judea and Samaria, which they renamed the West Bank, and they had East Jerusalem. And this is an important part. What they did in those places was to expel the Jews. You could call it a nakba if you wanted to use an Arab word. They said the Jews must leave.
Ethnic cleansing. And religious sites, many of them were desecrated. That's
right? Graveyards were dug up. Tombstones were used to pave roads or lavatories. I mean, again,
synagogues destroyed.
No
access to the Western Wall.
That's right. All of that. So, and this is an important part that we had people say, well, yeah, what about the refugees from that War of Independence? There were refugees. There were people who left. There were people who fled. There were people who, maybe some were pushed out. I believe that. You get into a war, there's a shot from a village. You may push out that village. They go to other places. But the Jordanians did not say, okay, now we have Jewish citizens. How wonderful. We'll be tolerant. No, they have to leave. And I think to this day, you cannot be a Jewish and a citizen of Jordan.
You had, in the aftermath of the 1948 war, about 1 million Jews throughout the Middle East that were driven out. I mean, these are Jews who had been living in countries like Iraq and Syria,
Yemen, Algeria, Cairo, Alexandria,
2,000 plus years, and overnight gone. And no compensation for their real estate, no compensation for their assets. It's be thankful that we're letting you live, and now leave. And Israel took them in, almost all of them. And so the idea that, okay, there are refugees after a war. And what makes what's happening right now, just as an aside, post-October 7th with what's happening in Gaza, is it seems like it's the only war zone in the history of the world where people are not allowed to leave. It's an amazing thing that no one is allowed to leave Gaza. It's as if people saying, hey, we don't actually want to live in a war zone. We actually have an Arab country that's right on our border called Egypt. Why don't we just go into the Sinai until the fighting's done, and then we'll figure out what happens next.
Why don't the Egyptians say, okay, and if you don't want them, you don't want to absorb them, you don't want to make them citizens, all right, but you can say Sinai is a big place.
Yeah, and all the humanitarian aid you want in over there.
Let's get them out of the war zone, for goodness sake, because there are civilians who don't want to be part of this war. I'm sure there are Gazans who don't. Let's let them out. The international community, quote unquote, will pay for the tents, will pay to feed them, and they will be far away from combat. But no, and by the way, the U.S., it seems to me, my criticism here of my government, the U.S. should be saying to the Egyptians, we give you a lot of money, we give you a lot of support. I know this is tough, but you have to let in refugees from the war who we promise you we will help resettle after the war goes on. And two things they should be saying. One is, you don't really like Hamas, which is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. You don't. And also, you were kind of responsible for your border with Gaza over these past 20 years. And guess what we now understand? You allowed tunnels built under, and you allowed weapons to flow in. And this whole situation came about largely because, I mean, we didn't know. I guess the Israelis didn't know. You weren't doing what you should be doing, which is enforcing your border and not letting weapons go that were going to be used against the Israelis with whom you were at peace and who are helping you in other ways. For example, one of the problems in the Sinai is Islamic State has cells there, whatever you want to call it, and the Israelis are helping with intelligence and all that. You haven't reciprocated. Anyway, that's one of the things that the U.S. should be doing. But I'll tell you what the other is. I can't help myself. In Qatar, the Biden administration made Qatar a major non-NATO ally sometime very early in the Biden administration. And I understand that they and the Israelis said, okay, so you have Hamas leaders living in Doha in luxury in Qatar. And that means you can mediate. That means you can be an intermediary. But you have some responsibilities. And one is you should know about something like 10-7 and not allow it to happen, or at least let us know through intelligence. And two, when it does happen, you should say to the leaders who are living in Qatar, you are either accomplices to war crimes or you're going to help us end this conflict quickly. And evidently neither of those things happened, and I don't really understand it. All right, let's move on. But okay, so... All right. So you got really interested when you went there in Israel and the history. And
I couldn't believe I didn't know anything about it. I went to Jewish day school growing up, and somehow they never taught us about Israel. And so I'm hearing about this for the first time.
They probably didn't teach you Hebrew either.
Not much. And so I went over to this teacher. I said, I want to know more about this. Where could I learn more about this? And he recommends a book called O Jerusalem by, I think, Walter Collins and Dominique Lapierre. It's the account of Israel's War of Independence, 1948. And I somehow tracked down this book. It's pre-Amazon in some used bookstore in Jerusalem. And I read this book, and I was just hooked. And I said, I wanted to be a part of this story. I wanted to learn as much of this history as I could. And I ultimately, after returning to the U.S. for university, would then move to Israel, make Aliyah, move to Israel with my wife. And we've been living there now for the last 21 years. All of our children born in Jerusalem. And for the last decade, I've been very privileged to work at the City of David, the historic site of biblical Jerusalem, the place where the kings of the Bible ruled and the prophets of the Bible preached. And in fact, for most people, when they close their eyes and they think of ancient Jerusalem, most people will imagine the old city of Jerusalem, the Via Dolorosa, the Church of Holy Sepulchre, the Western Wall, all great places. But when you speak of biblical Jerusalem, the Jerusalem of King David, King Solomon, prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, even Jesus, they're hanging out in the city of David, which is actually outside the walls of the old city. We lost Jerusalem, only to have it rediscovered relatively recently. And the interesting thing is, October 7th, do you know what Hamas called their campaign?
The Al-Aqsa Flood.
Right. The Al-Aqsa Flood attack. Al-Aqsa is referring to the Temple Mount.
Right.
Jerusalem. Now, why on earth is Hamas calling their campaign on October 7th the Al-Aqsa Flood attack, essentially the Jerusalem flood attack? What does it have to do with Jerusalem? Why didn't they call it the Gaza flood attack? Right? That would have been a name that made a lot more sense. And what is Hamas saying? What is this battle really over? It's not about Gaza, and it's not about the southern border communities, and it's not about Israel's northern border communities with Lebanon. What's this battle really over? It's about Jerusalem. And not just the physical territorial Jerusalem, but the ideological Jerusalem. There is a battle going on called a clash of civilizations over what the future of the world is going to look like. For much of the last 2,000 plus years, so much of Western civilization has been inspired by what could be called the Judeo-Christian heritage, Jerusalem's biblical heritage that has influenced Western civilization to this very day. And you have forces today that want something different. And that's what this is a battle over. Hamas is saying it's about Jerusalem, that we want Jerusalem to be the center for a new set of values that will be spread out into the world.
Why is it called, why flood? That's an odd thing at Jerusalem because, Jerusalem is kind of high up, not high up in terms of Mount Everest or the Rockies, but within that region. And so I don't think you have flooding in Jerusalem. I've never heard of that. Why flood? What did they mean? You know what they meant by that?
I think what they meant was they're going to take their millions of people and they're just going to flood
Jerusalem with
their people. And they're even Nasrallah in the north that
Nasrallah being the head of Hezbollah, from Lebanon. Yeah.
When Israel takes out Hezbollah terrorists, the way that Hezbollah, their propaganda, they say that they died in the battle for Jerusalem. Now, they're fighting up by Lebanon. What does it have to do with Jerusalem? But they're very clear. This is a battle over Jerusalem. Their ultimate ideological, spiritual goal is to have Jerusalem be the center of a vision that they have for the world.
Now, I want you to, in a second, come back to the discovery of the city of David, because people didn't know about it, and then when you started to explain why people thought ancient Jerusalem is like the old city, but the old city ain't so old. But before you do, just the city of David. Well, no, start with this. The Temple Mount is where the ancient Jewish temple, the first and the second, was. That would be what year?
So the first temple was built by David's son Solomon, which we're going back about 3,000 years ago.
3,000 years ago. Okay. And the second temple? The
second temple, at its glory, which was renovated by King Herod. We're talking about 2,000 years ago.
2,000 years ago.
Around the time of Jesus.
And the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built what year?
We're talking about 7th century CE, about 1,300 years ago.
1,300 years later, we're talking about, just so people get this timeline straight. And listen, there's a reason Al-Aqsa was built atop the Temple Mount. And I'm not faulting, I think I've heard you talk about this. In the ancient times, empires, to show that they were victors, to show they had defeated their enemy, would build their religious and other structures atop the ones of those they had defeated.
The Vatican is built atop a pagan temple as well.
Okay.
So that's
that was what was that?
Our God
that
is
was
stronger
the custom.
than your God.
Right. That's right. That was okay. That was the custom. Okay. So tell us this story now about people think old city of Jerusalem is old. People think that's where it all started, but not that long ago, somebody figured out, oh, wait a minute, that's not the case.
So Queen Victoria of England, she wants to discover the treasures of the Bible. Like the Ark of the Covenant, we're talking about 1867. She sends a man by the name of Captain Charles Warren to the Holy Land to find the treasures of the Bible. Now, if you want to find the treasures of the Bible, you'll go to Jerusalem. If you're going to search one place in Jerusalem, you'll go to the Temple Mount, the biblical Mount Moriah. And so that is, in fact, what happens. She sends a man by the name of Captain Charles Warren. And in 1867, he comes to Jerusalem. He goes to the Temple Mount, and he says, this is the spot to search for the treasures of the Bible. Except there's a problem. The problem is that the Ottomans, the Muslims, are controlling the area at that time. And
by the way, the Ottomans are an empire based in what we call Turkey. And I'm not going to go into that, but by the way, the Turks from Central Asia conquered Anatolia and later called it Turkey. Just so people know, when we're talking about settler colonialism, who we're talking about. Okay.
Exactly. So what happens next? Charles Warren wants to excavate the Temple Mount. The Ottomans, the Muslims, they say, Charles, we're sure you're a great guy, but you're not going to dig up the Temple Mount. To this day, due to religious sensitivities, political sensitivities, there has been virtually no archaeological activity on the Temple Mount. So Charles Warren, he can't go back to the Queen empty-handed. He says, if I can't dig on the Temple Mount, I will do the next best thing, which is to dig near it. He comes down the slopes of the Temple Mount, going to the south, walks through the Kidron Valley, and as he's walking through the valley, he comes across an ancient spring. A spring that's been flowing from today, going back thousands and thousands of years, and he sees it's flowing through an ancient man-made tunnel. He doesn't realize it, but he begins to walk through a tunnel engineered by the biblical King Hezekiah, direct descendant of King David, dating back some 2,700 years ago. Inside this tunnel is found an ancient inscription that is, in fact, in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum in Turkey. It's not on display because this inscription in ancient Hebrew talks about the tunnel that was engineered during the time of King Hezekiah, which of course would serve as affirmation, archaeologically speaking, to the fact that, wait a second, the Jews were in Jerusalem 2,700 years ago, which does not go with the story that the current administration in Turkey wants to promote. And therefore, what's known as the Siloam inscription is face down in a drawer somewhere, not on display. In fact, Israel has offered Turkey anything that we have in our collections that relate to the Islamic period. We will make a trade with draft picks to be thrown in later. Whatever you want in exchange for this Siloam inscription, which anyway is face down in the drawer that you're not making any use of. And they do not.
And what is it written as?
It's on a stone. It's a stone inscription,
okay,
etched into stone. It talks about where the two teams of diggers, it was a 533 meter long tunnel. And you have one team coming from one side, another coming from the other, no GPS, no radar. To this day, archaeologists, scientists, nobody knows how they were able to meet in the middle. Somehow, these two teams of diggers, again, no radar, no GPS, we're talking about 2,000 feet, how they were able to meet in the middle. About 20 years ago, there was something in downtown Boston known as the Big Dig. Renovating downtown Boston, the whole highways, the freeways there, and they were engineering a tunnel. And with all the latest technology, they missed.
They missed each other.
And yet, 2,700 years ago, not 20, but 2,700 years ago, a 2,000-foot long tunnel, two teams of diggers somehow meet in the middle. And in that spot, there's this ancient plaque which recounted the moment where they heard each other and they met in the middle. They embraced each other. It was found in the late 1800s, and it was taken back to Turkey, and it still sits there.
And the reason for this tunnel was
to protect the water source of Jerusalem against the impending invasion of King Sennacherib of Assyria. And what's amazing is that there is today two copies. One is in the British Museum, another is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, of the accounts of King Sennacherib of Assyria, where he speaks of his conquest of the kingdom of Judea with its capital, Jerusalem. And so we have the archaeological affirmation of the engineering feat to protect the water source of Jerusalem. We have the accounts of King Sennacherib of Assyria and his efforts to conquer Jerusalem, which failed. We have archaeological evidence of the king of Judea at the time, which was King Hezekiah. We have archaeological evidence and affirmation of the prophet who was active back then, which was the prophet Isaiah. So you have King Hezekiah, who's been proven archaeologically speaking 2,700 years ago. We have his wingman, the prophet Isaiah, who, if you've been to the United Nations, Isaiah Wall, right, that Isaiah, affirmation that he existed 2,700 years ago. King Sennacherib of Assyria, archaeological affirmation that he existed 2,700 years ago. His attempted conquest of Jerusalem that failed, archaeological evidence of that, and archaeological evidence of the efforts of King Hezekiah 2,700 years ago to protect the water source of Jerusalem, of the city of David. Not simply a matter of faith, but a matter of fact, incontrovertible affirmation going back 2,700 years of a Jewish presence in Jerusalem.
Two questions occur to me. One is the Bible is not a history, but it's not totally imaginary either. How have you looked at this for a long time and tried to see what's in the Bible and what is the archaeological evidence prove? How would you describe what the Bible is in terms of history? It's based on, or it's how would you?
So what is the purpose of the Bible? I would say the purpose of the Bible, and this is, say, from a spiritual perspective, it's a user manual for how to live a meaningful life. If a person believes that the Bible is divine or divinely inspired, then it's God's vision for this is how you could live a good, fulfilling life. Now, put that aside. The Bible obviously goes through many historical periods and many historical events. And comfortably, you could go back close to 2,900 years ago, some would argue even 3,000 plus years ago, and you could take the archaeology in one hand, you could take the biblical account on the other, and you'll find time after time the archaeology is matching the biblical account. Not simply as a matter of faith, but as a matter of fact. In fact, just about a week or two ago, there was a headline that international headline, and it relates to something that happened to me probably about 7-8 years ago. I was in the city of David, leading a tour for a group of professors, academics, who generally, let's say, are not the biggest advocates for the Bible. And I spoke to them about how up until 1993, there was no archaeological evidence that King David ever existed. You could believe he existed, but until 1993, you could not prove that there was a historical King David. Until 1993, when in an excavation in Israel's north, in a place called Tel Dan, a large stone inscription is discovered. And on this inscription, it dates to about 100 or so years after David would have lived, a king named King Hazael of Aram. Aram is modern-day Syria. King Hazael is mentioned in the Bible, also 2 Kings, and he's very proud. He's very happy. Why? because this ancient inscription describes how he had just won a major military victory over a king from the house of David. Now, if there's a house of David, what does that mean? There's a King David. So now virtually everyone agrees there's a King David. And so I shared this with the group. And one of these professors says, okay, that's fine. Okay, so maybe there's a David. But he was like a small-time gang leader. He was like the mayor of like some backwater village in South Dakota. Okay, so you're the mayor. Great, wonderful. You have like 3 followers and 6 sheep, and that's your kingdom. But King David was clearly not the regional power that the Bible makes him out to be. And I said, you know what? I said, that's exactly what's being debated today in archaeological circles. How big was David's kingdom? And some would argue it's bigger, others smaller. But I said, tell me something. I said, 30 years ago, what were people debating when it came to David? Whether or not he existed. Today we're debating how big his kingdom was, which means the archaeological discoveries being made throughout the region, and in particular in the city of David, the place where Jerusalem began, allow a person to not only believe, but to know that Jerusalem's biblical heritage can be affirmed, not simply as a matter of faith, but as a matter of fact. And just 2 weeks ago, major headline, based on all sorts of carbon studies and testing, that now archaeologists and scientists are saying, wait a second, we can actually prove that biblical Jerusalem, going back to the time of David and Solomon, was actually much bigger than what the academic world was willing to give credit up until now. That the science, the archaeology, is actually affirming the biblical account of the scope of Jerusalem going back some 3,000 years. So you don't have to be a person of faith. You're not just saying, well, I'm going to take it on God's word.
Right, right. And David came to the area, to this, what became the city of David, and this area that became Jerusalem, because we're starting where from where?
He was king for the first almost 7 years of his rule in a place called Hebron,
which still exists.
Where
it's part of it. It's under the palace. Well,
you have parts of it under Israeli control, and others that are controlled by the by the Palestinians today, but Hebron is a place that the Jewish people have had a continuous presence for 3,000 years. You have the tomb of the patriarchs built by King Herod 2,000 years ago. It is in the world, it is the longest active use building in the world for what it was originally built for. So what it was built for 2,000 years ago is still the very same thing that it's used for today. Over the last 2,000 years, Christians have built a church there. Muslims have built a mosque there. But you still have the same tomb, the same structure, same building, going back 2,000 years.
This is a really stupid question, but I have no pride. Hebrew, linguistically, are they connected? Well, what is Hebrew? Is Hebron?
So Hebron, in Hebrew is Chevron.
Hebron. Okay.
And they say that, why is it called Chevron?
Yeah.
So one thing that actually Jews and Muslims agree on is that Abraham was viewed as the friend of God. And so Chevron comes from the root of the Hebrew word chaver, which means friend, and Muslims call Chevron al-Khalil, and it also means friendship. Okay. And so both actually agree, Jews and Arabs, that Abraham was the friend of God. What happened after that, we start to get into some disagreements.
So David was of the tribe of Abraham.
Well, he was a descendant of Abraham. He's from the tribe of Judah.
Oh, okay.
And so you have the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
And initially, David is only ruling over the tribe of Judah. And so his capital city is Hebron, which is within the territory of the tribe of Judah. Afterwards, you have the other tribes, and they say, David, why don't you become king over all of us? And David, quoting Mel Brooks, he says, it's good to be the king. And he says, sure, why rule only over one tribe when you can rule over 12? And so he then moves his capital to Jerusalem. Now, why Jerusalem?
But just as digression, when tribes come together, they form a nation.
There you go.
That's what it means, to form a nation. When nations are conquered, they become an empire.
Now, I'm gonna ask you a question. And if we have to edit this out, okay?
Danielle can do it if we have
to. Why was Washington, D.C. chosen as the capital of the United States of America?
Because it was seen as between the South and the North, and the South and the North, we knew early on were going to have fraternal difficulties.
So it's a neutral capital.
A neutral capital,
It could represent everybody equally.
Yeah. To put a capital in this swamp made no sense whatsoever back then. And there weren't even good golf courses back then, so there's no good reason for it. Yeah.
It's hard to play golf in the swamp.
You can do it, but you got to do a little work on it.
Where did the founding fathers get their inspiration on how to pick a capital? Now, we know the founding fathers were biblically knowledgeable.
They were very much so.
Now, whether you say they were believers, some of them were, some of them weren't, but they were certainly, they knew the Bible. Right. Where did they get their inspiration for how to pick a capital?
I see where you're going, but go ahead.
And so what happened? David his original capital is in Hebron. And what happens? He now is going to become king over all the tribes. And so he goes to Jerusalem. Now, why does he go to Jerusalem? Now, you could say David is many things. The Bible describes David as a warrior. David fights Goliath, many others. David was a poet. He writes many of the Psalms in the Bible. David was also a politician. And David understands that if he's going to rule over the entire nation, he has to have a capital that's representative of all the people. Jerusalem was a neutral territory. It sat directly between two tribes, the tribes of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Now, David may be a politician, and he say, I'm a man of the people, the capital has to represent the people, but David's also no fool. And he realizes if he's going to stay in power, which tribe is going to keep him in power? His tribe, Judah. And so Jerusalem might be neutral territory, but it's right next to the tribe of Judah, so they literally have his back. But now, David also understands something else, which is very relevant to today. America is a divided society. People talk about, 2024, if this one wins, we're not going to accept it. That one wins. What civil war? Who knows what's going to happen here, right? David understood that the first king of Israel, King Saul, came from the tribe of Benjamin. David comes from the tribe of Judah. How does the tribe of Benjamin feel that now there's a king from the tribe of Judah? Probably the same way that Republicans feel about when a Democrat gets elected, and when Democrats feel when a Republican gets elected. Nobody's happy. And so what does David try to do? Jerusalem is a neutral capital, belongs to everyone. It's also next to his tribe. But there's also one other tribe that it's next to, and that's the tribe of Benjamin. What is David saying to the opposition? He's saying, yes, okay, Judah's ruling now. But the only other tribe that the capital is right next to their territory is you guys. You guys are tribe 1B, right? Judah's 1A, you guys are 1B. He's trying to unite the opposition. So you have a capital that belongs to the people, and also a way to bring, in a certain sense, North and South together. And when you look at the founding fathers, who knew the Bible, who viewed themselves as the new Israel, and in so many ways, the way they were establishing the United States of America was based on biblical inspiration of the Judeo-Christian heritage. They certainly understood how David selected his capital.
And who were the Jebusites?
The Jebusites were one of the Canaanite tribes.
Okay. And the Canaanites were?
The Canaanites were native peoples. There were a number of different Canaanite tribes, and they had their little fiefdoms and kings and so on. And they've been in the land for a really long time. Going already back to the time of Abraham, the Bible recounts some 3,800 years ago that the Canaanites are already in the land, right? So they've been there for a long time. And David wants to make Jerusalem his capital. And the amazing thing is, the Bible tells us that for 400 years before David comes to Jerusalem, this is a fortified city. No one can conquer the city.
And that's because it's on a hill, and so it's hard for armies to get up there.
That's right. So they have the high ground. Right. They had massive walls, massive fortifications, which we've discovered. Dating back more than 3,000 plus years, we've discovered the massive fortress and the massive walls that surround the city. And also they controlled something very important, which is the water. Right.
You have a city on a hill, you still need a water source.
And they have the water and have a fortress that ensure that the only people who would have access to the water were people coming from inside the walls of the city. So the Jebusites, going back some 3,000 plus years, they understand the importance of the high ground. They understand the importance of natural resources, and they understood engineering. And they built a city with massive walls that protected the only water source in the area that could sustain, a life of thousands of people. And now David has a problem.
All right, before you get to that problem, how he solves it, I just want to make one thing clear. We have the Jebusites, we have the Canaanites. there are some Palestinians who claim, oh yeah, we're the descendants of the Canaanites, or we're the descendants of the Jebusites, or we're the descendants of the Philistines. There's no historical evidence for any of that. Because, I mean, if you're an Arab, you came from Arabia, and there were Arabs much later. We're talking 7th century. Muhammad formed a religion, an army, and it was one of the great conquering armies the world has ever seen. It swept through Judea, it swept through Samaria, it swept through Egypt, which was not then Arabic, which was Coptic Christian. It swept across North Africa. It swept up into Spain. I mean, brilliant conquering army. You have to give it all the credit, but you can't acknowledge that history and also say, oh yeah, these Canaanites, these Jebusites, they've been here all this time and it's just the Jews or the interlopers. That's just simply not, there's no factual evidence, no archaeological evidence, no document, nothing to that. Okay, just so we make sure that's clear, and I think then we go to what David did that was militarily quite clever, understanding Jerusalem's on a hill, it's got a water source. How can I use that to my advantage? Take it from there.
So I was giving a tour a couple of years ago to a group from West Point. And I thought, well, if they're from West Point, and one of the people was John Spencer, who is expert in urban warfare.
He is the top expert in urban warfare, and he's been very interesting in terms of the current conflict with Gaza. Yeah.
And so we're on this tour, and I'm thinking, okay, he's an expert in urban warfare. And the more I think about it, the city of David has a history going back thousands of years of urban warfare. David has to conquer a city. How is he conquering this city, right, that no one can conquer? A heavily fortified city.
He wants Jerusalem, as you said, to be the capital between Benjamin, but the Jebusites are there.
That's right.
Okay, he's going to conquer them. Let's be clear. He is not going to, negotiate this. He's going to conquer them. Okay.
And so now he has a problem, which is how do you conquer a heavily fortified city? And in fact, if a person looks in the Bible in 2 Samuel chapter 5, you actually have biblical trash talk where the Jebusites are standing atop their walls and they're shouting down to David and his men, we could put our blind and our lame on top of these walls and you still won't be able to conquer the city. They have so much confidence in their defenses that they could put the weakest segments of society as the defenders of the city, you still can't conquer the city. And you know what? They're right. Because David does not try to scale the walls or break through or anything like that. What does he do? He says, whoever can conquer the Jebusite stronghold must strike at the water channel. And it's this mysterious phrasing, but what ends up happening is the original Navy SEALs, they somehow penetrate through an irrigation channel beneath the fortress. They come up from the spring, taking the fortress by surprise. And once you have the spring and once you have the fortress, you have the city. And it's an amazing thing that David had to come up with a real world way how to conquer the city. And we still have the fortress, and we still have the channel that he and his men almost certainly would have gone through to conquer the city. It's all still there in the city of David. You can come see it for yourself. And it's still standing 3,000 years later. And so we see that there was this real city 3,000 years ago, going back to the time that David would have lived. We find the walls. We have the spring. We have all the pieces of the story going back thousands and thousands of years.
Jerusalem was conquered. The Jebusites were conquered. What happened to the Jebusites?
The Jebusites, at least the ones that were living there, I would say that they probably were not going out for drinks afterwards.
Though I've seen references, again, to histories where it said the Jebusites dwelt with the children of Judah at Jerusalem and eventually mixed with them. It wasn't a total wipeout, extermination.
Yeah.
It was...
Look, back then, certainly you would have had a situation where if they're willing to accept, let's say, the rules of the home team, great. And that was also kind of the spirit of the time, which is you could essentially have three choices. You could, join up with a new team. You could go elsewhere, or you'll go elsewhere.
Right. Okay. So Was there a city of David down the valley from the hill from Jerusalem that built up at that time, or was that in other words, how did that structure? Because it was David's son Solomon who said, "Okay, we're going to build the most important religious
right."
So the temple,
the Temple Mount.
We're not going to build it by the spring.
Right.
It'd be convenient, but we're not going to do it that way. We're going to build it up there, and then it's going to be, and this I know you're going to get into, there's going to be a road from the spring up to Jerusalem that is utilized for centuries.
So Solomon will expand Jerusalem, expand the city of David to the north, incorporating
the hill,
incorporating Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, into the city. The Temple Mount was the high point of Jerusalem. So there was both you're going to build your temple at the highest point, but also there was a spiritual message, which is perhaps different from other ancient civilizations, which is that the king is not the most important figure in society. That the people may be subservient to the king, but both the people and the king are subservient to God. And therefore, even the king is looking up to somebody. And that was a message that has been part of the biblical idea that even our leaders are accountable. You had prophets in the biblical era that were meant to speak truth to power. And so that idea that you have the temple on the Temple Mount is even the king sitting in his palace is still looking up at the temple of God. And so now, as you mentioned, if we go back to 2004, archaeologists, as a result of a busted sewage pipe, they uncover a series of ancient stone steps going back some 2,000 years, towards the time of Jesus, about 1,000 years after David. And they find these ancient stone steps, and they realize those steps are going down to the ancient pool of Siloam. Now, what was the pool of Siloam? For Christians, the pool of Siloam has deep significance. In the Bible tells us that 3 times a year, all of Israel has to go on pilgrimage up to the temple atop the Temple Mount. Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. Now, before you can go up to the temple, you have to wash, cleanse, bathe, inner ritual bath. The historian Josephus says 2,000 years ago, you would have had nearly 2.7 million people going on pilgrimage up to the temple, say on Passover, 2,000 years ago. And so the archaeologists, they find the pool of Siloam, which is being excavated at the southern end of the city of David.
Fed by the spring.
Right, fed by the spring, which is still flowing, and it's the same pool, going back some 2,000 years ago. The original pool of Siloam goes back some 2,700 years ago to the time of King Hezekiah. They find the pool, which again is being excavated as we speak by archaeologists of the Israel Antiquities Authority in the city of David. And the archaeologists say, well, if we know where the pool is, and we know where the temple stood atop the Temple Mount, separated by about a half a mile, how did the millions of pilgrims get from the pool all the way up to the temple? And so they widen the excavation. And what do they discover? They discover what has been called the most significant archaeological discovery of the last 100 years. They discover what's known today as the Pilgrimage Road.
And just so we be clear, there were wars against the Jews from these various empires that conquered it. There were expulsions. There was mass murder. There was enslavement. They never got rid of all the Jews. They were always there. They were always there. I mean, in Jerusalem, in Hebron, as you mentioned, in the Galilee, they managed. And of course, some began to come back. Yes, in the 19th century, the Ottomans didn't mind so much. When they came back, what did they do? They call them migrants if you want to. They bought land from Arabs. They didn't steal it. They bought it. They created new cities like Tel Aviv, which was a city the Jews built. They brought in Arab labor to help them do that. They took it from a swamp north of Jaffa. So the Jews never were entirely expelled, and they never gave up their patrimony. That just is also an important thing. They weren't all, anyhow. We're doing 3,000 years of history, so we need to cherry pick. So here's at least one other thing I want to, and then I'll let you tell whatever last thing. In 1967, when the Israelis were under an existential threat from their neighbors, and they did win, and they did take back from Jordan, East Jerusalem. One of the things they took most of was the Temple Mount. There's famous picture of the soldiers there. As I remember the story, I think it's from Michael Oren's book, from others as well. Soldiers went up on the Temple Mount and planted an Israeli flag, and Moshe Dayan said, "You know what? Take it down." They said, "Why take it down? We've got it back." He said, No. We're going to have sovereignty. We're going to have security control. But I'm going to do something else. I'm going to give religious control as a gesture. Maybe it'll be reciprocated. We'll see. I'm going to give religious control to a religious Waqf, a foundation, Jordanian. I'm going to let Muslim clerics have religious control of this site. And that's what he did. And the problem is, well, you tell me what the problem is after that. It was certainly not this gesture, which was an amazing gesture, has not been quite reciprocated.
The Middle East is not the Midwest. In 1967, when Israel liberates Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, the Mount of Olives, the Old City, the City of David, the Muslim religious officials at that time actually presented the IDF with the keys to the Temple Mount. They accepted that they had lost and that Israel had won, and they were grateful to at least be able to walk away with their lives. When Israel decided to take the most significant site in the country, the Temple Mount, probably in the world, but certainly in the country, and to, as a gesture of goodwill, to give it to the Muslims, the way that was interpreted in the Middle East was not, oh, wow, this is great, and we're going to live in peace, and it's going to be wonderful. It was, oh, we thought that these people were serious and that they were going to win, and that we would now have to respect that they were here, and now we have to respect that they're the sovereign. When Israel, both as far as the Temple Mount is concerned, but also throughout Judea and Samaria, when Israel failed to be clear about its intentions, when Israel did not apply sovereignty, not over the Temple Mount, not over Judea and Samaria, what that said to the Muslim world was, oh, okay, we had a setback. They, yes, maybe defeated us in this round, but they're not actually serious about staying here. And if they're willing to give away these places, and places that they know from our perspective are the most important places, what gives Israel legitimacy to exist in the land of Israel is Jerusalem, is the Temple Mount, is the City of David. Tel Aviv is a nice place, but historically speaking, Tel Aviv is a modern city. The places that root us in this land going back thousands and thousands of years, those are the places like Hebron, like Shiloh, like Bethel, like Shechem. All these are the places that today are the ones that in 1967 Israel essentially gave back. And when you do that, the way that's understood in the Middle East is a sign of weakness. And ever since then, Israel's been paying for that mistake, which is not being clear about your intentions. And if your intention is this is your land and you have a right to it, just like in the Middle East, no one could imagine if you had a dispute with a neighbor and be like, all right, well, in order to settle this dispute, well, I'll share my wife with you, right? That would be insane. No one would say such a thing. It's humiliating, right? In the Middle East, you don't share your land either. You don't share. If you say this is the land that God gave you, if this is the land that has been yours for thousands of years where you've been living in it, you don't then go and say, but okay, for peace, I'm going to give it to you. The way that's interpreted, even if you have the best of intentions, the way that's interpreted in the Middle East is, oh, well, if they're willing to give us this, and this is some of the most significant places within the land, well, we'll get the rest of it from them eventually also. And that's what we've been dealing with for the last, since 1967, is Israel has not fully asserted itself in its own land. From the other side, this is not just a territorial conflict, but it's also a spiritual, ideological conflict. In Islam, there are two types of land. There's Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. The Middle East falls under Dar al-Islam, which means this is land that must only be under the rule of Islam, because once upon a time it was Islamic area, and therefore it has to remain Islamic. The idea that non-Muslims could rule anywhere within what they call Dar al-Islam, Islamic land, is unacceptable to them from a spiritual, ideological, political. It's a non-starter. The idea that Israel, a Jewish state, in the midst of what they believe should be Islamic land, is a non-starter.
Well, if it's not Dar al-Islam, to them it must be Dar al-Har,
Right,
which means a land of war.
Right, which you have to conquer by
and
the sword.
And Hamas that is the theology/ideology of Hamas. It's not the theology of all Muslims. I know plenty of Muslims, I'm sure you do too, who say, you know what, tolerance is not a bad idea. Living with neighbors is not a bad idea. It can be done again, and it should be done again. We want this, plenty, but that's not what Hamas is or represents. I think that in
Israeli society, one of the most significant elements of Israeli society are the Druze, and the Druze are not Jewish, and they have their own faith, and yet the part of the faith of the Druze is they are loyal to whatever country they're a part of. So you have Druze who are primarily they live in the north of Israel, and so you have Druze that serve in the IDF, loyal citizens.
In fact, they insist upon it. They were told, you speak Arabic, you're Arabs, you're not Muslims, but you don't need to serve in the IDF. They said, we insist upon it. Right. And they are generals and colonels 100%. And special forces. All of that. No, and I'm a Druzophile, totally. I mean, I think they're fascinating culture, fascinating religion, fascinating people. One thing I want to do before we leave, and I know I got to let you go, is do a commercial for you in the sense that anybody who's going to Israel, there is nothing I think more interesting to see than the city of David, which is the archaeological dig continues. There's still, every time I go there, you or someone else says, "Oh, let me show you what's new here. Let me show you what we just dug up." It is the most amazing thing to see, and as you say, it doesn't matter whether you're religious or atheist, Christian or Jew. There's so much history being dug up there, and you do such a good job of explaining it and interpreting it and making it clear to people. They'd be crazy if you're going to Israel, going to Jerusalem, not to go visit the city of David. I just want to say that.
I'll end with a very quick story. Sometime over the last year, I was with a journalist in the city of David, and we're talking about the significance of the history and what's being discovered. A lot of the biblical affirmation based on these archaeological discoveries. And this journalist says to me, she says, do you really believe that, all these things happen as it says in the Bible or the scriptures or wherever? I said, it doesn't matter what I believe. I said, there's no place more than Jerusalem that for billions of people, they wake up in the morning and they look to Jerusalem as a source of meaning, faith, identity, inspiration, purpose, more than Washington, D.C., more than New York City, more than Rome, London, Riyadh, Moscow. There is no place in the world that matters more to more people than Jerusalem. And therefore, whether you're a person of faith or of no faith, you're religious, you're secular, you're right-wing, you're left-wing, conservative, progressive, liberal, it doesn't matter what you are. There's no place that matters more in terms of shaping the events of civilization in ancient times, in modern times, and based on what's happening in the world today, well into the future. If you want to understand why this place impacts our lives, whatever you may believe, you need to understand Jerusalem. And that is the city of David.
Ze'ev Orenstein, thanks so much for dropping in today. Thanks for this fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.